What if tomorrow the world wakes up and Ukraine's flag is flying over Crimea? No announcement, no speech, just one image that shocks Moscow, stuns NATO, and rewrites the entire war. This single moment wouldn't just be symbolic. It could collapse supply lines, break political narratives, and change global power calculations overnight. Today, we explore what this moment would really mean, how it could happen, and why it might become the most decisive turning point of the Ukraine war. Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we are discussing one of the most powerful and controversial scenarios of the entire Ukraine conflict. What if Ukraine's flag rose over Crimea? This idea alone carries enormous emotional, military, and geopolitical weight. Crimea is not just territory. It is a symbol of identity, power, and strategic dominance in the Black Sea. Since 2014, Russia has treated Crimea as untouchable, portraying it as permanently secured. But wars evolve, and so do possibilities. Raising a flag is more than a gesture. It signals control, legitimacy, and momentum. In modern warfare, symbolism can shift morale faster than missiles. For Ukraine, such a moment would represent justice, survival, and national unity. For Russia, it would strike at the heart of its narrative and expose vulnerability. The world would not see this as a small battlefield change. It would be interpreted as a strategic earthquake. Markets would react, alliances would recalibrate, and diplomatic language would instantly change. Even the idea forces policymakers to think differently. Today's video does not claim this has happened. Instead, we analyze what it would mean if it did. Step by step, we will explore military realities, political consequences, global reactions, and the psychological shockwaves such a moment would unleash. Stay with us, because understanding this scenario helps explain why Crimea remains the most dangerous flashpoint of the war. To understand why Crimea matters so much, we must look beyond maps and borders. Crimea controls access to the Black Sea, hosting naval bases, radar systems, and logistical hubs that shape regional power. For Russia, it is the cornerstone of its southern military posture. Losing influence, there would weaken Russia's ability to project force toward Eastern Europe, the Middle East, and the Mediterranean. For Ukraine, Crimea represents unfinished history. Its annexation in 2014 was not only a territorial loss, but a psychological wound. Reversing that loss would signal that international law still matters, and that aggression can be challenged. If Ukraine's flag appeared over Crimea, it would instantly raise questions about Russian defensive failures. Analysts would ask how supply routes were disrupted, how air defenses were breached, and whether internal fractures played a role. Such a development would also embolden Ukraine's supporters. Nations hesitant to provide aid might reconsider. Others could accelerate military and financial support. Meanwhile, Russian leadership would face internal pressure from elites, military bloggers, and the public. This is why Crimea is different from other fronts. It is not just about ground gained or lost. It is about credibility. Control of Crimea influences negotiations, ceasefire terms, and future security guarantees. A symbolic shift there could force conversations that months of fighting elsewhere could not achieve. This is precisely why every movement around Crimea is watched so closely by intelligence agencies worldwide. If such a moment were to occur, the military implications would be immediate and severe. Raising a flag implies at least temporary control, which would mean Russian forces failed to prevent penetration or collapse in a critical zone. This would raise alarms about the sustainability of Russia's defensive strategy. Crimea relies heavily on supply routes like the Kerch Bridge, sea corridors, and air transport. Disruption of these lifelines would isolate forces and reduce operational effectiveness. Ukraine would not need full occupation to change the war's trajectory. Even limited presence or symbolic control could undermine Russian command confidence. Morale matters deeply in prolonged conflicts. Soldiers fight differently when they believe territory is indefensible. A visible Ukrainian presence in Crimea would signal that no area is truly safe. It would also shift Ukraine's military posture from defense to strategic pressure. Instead of reacting, Ukraine could dictate tempo. Russia, meanwhile, would be forced into emergency redeployments, potentially weakening other fronts. This domino effect is what military planners fear most. One breakthrough can unravel carefully balanced defenses. Additionally, air and naval dynamics in the Black Sea would change. Insurance rates, shipping routes, and regional trade would all respond instantly. Even without a decisive battle, perception of control can reshape the battlefield. That is why this scenario is considered one of the most dangerous possibilities of the war. Beyond the battlefield, the political consequences would be enormous. Governments around the world would face pressure to respond, clarify positions, and adjust policies. For Ukraine's leadership, this moment would strengthen legitimacy and bargaining power. It would demonstrate that long-term resistance can produce results, even against a larger adversary. For Russia's leadership, the opposite would be true. Questions would arise about strategic judgment, military preparedness, and internal stability. Political rivals and critics would gain ammunition. Internationally, narratives would shift rapidly. Media coverage would frame the event as a turning point, regardless of how limited it actually was on the ground. This matters because public perception influences policy. Countries that remain neutral might quietly tilt toward Ukraine. Sanctions discussions could intensify, while diplomatic isolation of Russia might deepen. At the same time, global institutions would brace for escalation risks. Any perceived loss of Crimea could trigger unpredictable responses. That is why world leaders would issue cautious statements, urging restraint while preparing for volatility. Elections in multiple countries could be influenced by how leaders respond. Energy markets would react to perceived instability in the Black Sea region. In short, one flag could force dozens of capitals into emergency meetings. This is the power of symbolism combined with strategic geography. It compresses complex realities into a single image the world cannot ignore. The psychological dimension of this scenario may be even more powerful than the military or political effects. Wars are fought not only with weapons but with belief. For Ukrainian society, seeing their flag over Crimea would reinforce resilience and sacrifice. It would validate years of loss, displacement, and resistance. National unity would surge, strengthening internal cohesion. For Russian society, the impact could be destabilizing. Crimea has been presented as sacred, non-negotiable, and permanently secured. Any challenge to that narrative could create cognitive dissonance. When official messaging clashes with visible reality, trust erodes. This does not automatically lead to collapse, but it increases uncertainty. Soldiers at the front might question leadership decisions. Families might question the cost of continued fighting. Even controlled media environments struggle to fully contain such moments. International audiences would also react emotionally. Supporters of Ukraine would feel vindicated, while skeptics would reassess assumptions. This emotional momentum matters because it shapes donations, activism, and political pressure abroad. In modern conflicts, perception spreads faster than facts. A single image shared online can reach millions within minutes. That speed magnifies psychological impact. Even if control were temporary, the memory would persist. This is why military planners obsess over symbols. They understand that once belief shifts, reversing it becomes extremely difficult. Crimea, in this sense, is not just land. It is a story people tell themselves about power and permanence. Global security dynamics would also be affected immediately. NATO would reassess risk levels across Eastern Europe and the Black Sea. Defensive postures could be strengthened, surveillance intensified, and contingency plans updated. While NATO would avoid direct involvement, preparedness would increase. For countries like Turkey, Romania, and Bulgaria, Black Sea stability is critical. Any perceived shift in control would force recalculations. Meanwhile, non-Western powers would watch closely. China, in particular, would analyze responses, narratives, and escalation patterns. How the world reacts to a potential loss of Crimea could influence calculations in other contested regions. This is why the scenario extends far beyond Ukraine and Russia. It becomes a case study in deterrence, alliance cohesion, and international norms. Financial markets would also respond. Risk premiums would rise, currencies could fluctuate, and investors would seek safe havens. Energy flows through the region would face renewed scrutiny. Even if no immediate disruption occurred, anticipation alone can move markets. Diplomatic channels would become more active, with backdoor communications attempting to prevent uncontrolled escalation. In essence, the entire international system would enter a heightened alert phase. This demonstrates how a localized event can have systemic consequences. Crimea sits at the intersection of military strategy, economic stability, and global order. That is why this hypothetical moment carries such extraordinary weight. It is important to emphasize that scenarios like this do not emerge from a single action. They are the result of long-term pressure, adaptation, and opportunity. Ukraine has demonstrated flexibility, learning from early setbacks and integrating new capabilities. Russia has also adapted, reinforcing defenses and adjusting tactics. This makes any dramatic shift highly complex. That complexity is why analysts discuss possibilities rather than predictions. A flag appearing over Crimea would likely reflect cumulative effects rather than sudden collapse. Intelligence failures, logistical strain, morale issues, and external support would all intersect. Understanding this helps avoid simplistic conclusions. Wars rarely turn on one event alone, but certain moments crystallize change. They become reference points historians use to explain broader shifts. If such a moment occurred, it would not end the war instantly. Instead, it would reshape its trajectory. Negotiations might accelerate, demands could harden, or escalation risks might increase. Outcomes would depend on decisions made in the aftermath. This is why strategic restraint and communication would be critical. the danger of miscalculation would be high. Every actor would seek advantage while trying to avoid catastrophic escalation. That balance is extremely delicate. Studying this scenario helps us understand why leaders speak cautiously and why symbolic actions carry such risk. In high-intensity conflicts, perception and reality are constantly interacting, shaping choices at every level. Media framing would play a decisive role in how this moment is understood. Headlines, images, and commentary would influence public interpretation within hours. Some outlets would frame it as liberation, others as provocation. Language matters because it sets expectations. Governments would attempt to control narratives, emphasizing restraint or resolve depending on interests. Social media would amplify extremes, spreading both hope and fear. This information environment complicates crisis management. Leaders would need to respond quickly, but carefully. Any ambiguous statement could be misread as escalation or weakness. This is where strategic communication becomes as important as troop movements. The credibility of institutions would be tested. Fact-checking, verification, and context would struggle to keep pace with viral content. This creates space for misinformation and emotional reactions. Understanding this helps explain why symbolic acts are treated with such caution. A flag is simple, but its interpretation is not. It carries layers of meaning depending on audience. For some, it represents justice. For others, threat. Managing these interpretations would be an enormous challenge. Allies would coordinate messaging to avoid mixed signals. Adversaries would probe for fractures. In this sense, the information battlefield would be just as active as the physical one. This highlights a key feature of modern war. Control of narrative can influence outcomes almost as much as control of territory. Crimea would become the focal point of that struggle. Looking ahead, the long-term implications would depend on follow-through. Symbolic moments require consolidation to translate into lasting change. Without sustained control, symbolism fades. With it, new realities emerge. If Ukraine could leverage such a moment into diplomatic momentum, security guarantees, or improved positioning, the impact would endure. If not, the risk of backlash would grow. For Russia, responses could range from intensified pressure to attempts at negotiation. Internal dynamics would shape choices. International actors would try to stabilize the situation while protecting interests. This uncertainty underscores why analysts treat Crimea as uniquely sensitive. It concentrates risk. Decisions made there resonate globally. Studying hypothetical scenarios helps policymakers prepare, reducing the chance of impulsive reactions. It also helps the public understand why restraint and caution are often emphasized. Dramatic images can obscure complexity. By unpacking layers, we gain clearer insight. Ultimately, wars are decided by systems, not symbols alone. But symbols can accelerate or disrupt those systems. That is why this scenario matters even if it remains hypothetical. It reveals fault lines, priorities, and fears. It shows where pressure points exist. Understanding them is essential for anyone trying to make sense of the conflict beyond daily headlines. In conclusion, the idea of Ukraine's flag rising over Crimea represents far more than a territorial question. It encapsulates military strategy, political legitimacy, psychological resilience, and global stability. This is why it captures attention so powerfully. Whether or not such a moment ever occurs, analyzing it helps us understand the stakes of the war. Crimea remains a symbol precisely because it sits at the intersection of history and power. Any shift there would reverberate far beyond the peninsula. As viewers, it is important to approach such topics with critical thinking rather than emotion alone. Hypotheticals are tools for understanding, not predictions. They allow us to explore consequences without assuming inevitability. This perspective is crucial in an information environment driven by urgency and shock. By examining what such a moment could mean, we gain insight into why decisions are made, why risks are managed, and why restraint is sometimes prioritized over spectacle. The war in Ukraine is not just about land. It is about narratives, alliances, and the future of international norms. Crimea sits at the center of those questions. Understanding its significance helps us see the bigger picture. Thank you for watching, and remember to evaluate information carefully as events continue to unfold. If you found this analysis valuable, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and share your thoughts in the comments. Your support helps us bring deeper, fact-based geopolitical content.